So we have a recording of what we talked about here. So here we have a new events calendar. I'll share my screen as well. So let's see, I can just show you this. Okay, so this is the Reimagine Rebuild Brook Valley website, and we have this new events calendar. So we've got the meetings here, and this is our meeting here today, and it has the Zoom link, and it will have a link to the agenda, etc. And we may actually just build a page per meeting type that explains what this meeting is, has all the prior agendas, has the recordings, and all of that all in one place. I think that will make it easier for us to include more people going forward. Does that sound like we're doing it? I'm open to feedback on that as well. Does that sound like it solves the problem that you were?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for reminding me. Let me stop sharing again. Let's see. So, yeah. And so we do have a survey that we'd like to put out in terms of the working groups. Katie, could you drop that link as the kind of the form that's fill outable into the chat? So what we're going to be doing is asking everybody if they would like to, what working groups they would be interested in participating in, and it's no obligation. You can show up, and if it's interesting and engaging for you, continue attending. And what days of the week and what kind of time slots, usually in the afternoons, would work best for you. And so we will start having those meetings on our events list as well, and we'll start really engaging with, okay, what's happening in our community? What can we? How can we join that? Is there anything missing? Can we add that? Who else should be in this conversation? We'll just be working to move projects along in that way, and that really we're kind of shifting into that operational mode now that summer's almost over. So yeah, if you can either during the meeting just open it up, or at the end of the meeting, please fill that out and forward it along to anybody who you think might be interested, and we'll do a mass distribution to the entire list for R3V. But if you know some people who have been thinking about it but been waiting for this moment, that'd be great if you could distribute that. And so we'll get all those get all that rolling. Let's see. So the next thing I wanted to do was to introduce Julie O'Dwyer, who probably with this group needs no introduction. But Julie, will you tell us who you are and what you're going to offer us today, and
Sure.
what you learned down in Paradise?
Hi, I'm Julie O'Dwyer. I am the chair for the Housing and Construction Subcommittee for the Jackson County Long-Term Recovery Group. I'm also a local architectural and interior designer, community member, vice president of the board of the Ashland Food Co-op, and I attend a lot of meetings. But I went down to Paradise earlier this summer by myself, and also went to Santa Cruz and Sonoma and Napa, and came back really kind of getting a really better understanding of kind of what disasters like after a fire and how the community pulls together, and suggested to some members of our long-term recovery group that we might want to do another visit down there at the end of this summer, just so that people could kind of get an understanding of where that community's at 3 years post-fire, if there's things we can learn from them, but also really just to create a stronger connection to another fire-affected community that is dealing with similar issues that we're dealing with. And so I was really lucky to have, there were 6 of us who went down, and it was amazing for everyone for lots of different reasons, lots of positives, lots of eye-opening experiences, lots of connections. And so as a result of that, we put together a document, which I've turned into a slideshow, and I wanted to just share that with everyone here, let people kind of know about what we learned down there. And I just want to do a caveat with that, what we learned doesn't mean that we're not doing it here. It just means that it's something that we recognize was very significant in their recovery, and whether or not we want to engage in those kind of ideas further or not is really up to our community. But we had some really important sort of eye-opening experiences. So Stephen, can you share? Let me share a screen. Actually, I think you're doing that. So. Oops, apologize. Let me just go back. So our trip to Paradise, like I said, we learned an awful lot, but there's some things that I really want to make sure that the people here in Jackson County understand, that there are differences to the disaster that happened down there and the disaster that happened in our community. And it points out why some of their responses have been different, but also points out some of the things that are, I don't want to call them advantages, but things that we didn't have to deal with, which we need to be very grateful that fire recovery has actually moved forward quite a bit in the last 3 years. So one of the big differences is their amount of loss of population. They went from a town of around 27,000 to currently they're just around 6,000 residents. That is a huge loss of residents. And that doesn't even include all of the commercial properties that were destroyed. We were affected significantly. Certain communities were affected disproportionate than others, but we did not lose a vast majority of our population. Paradise also had absolutely no one who wasn't affected, and affected very directly and very overwhelmingly. Our fire, we definitely have a certain population that has been affected disproportionately, but there are a lot of people who really have moved on and that hasn't really affected them on a day-to-day basis. Paradise also had some significant infrastructure issues that really kind of intensified their recovery. And that included the fact that their city is fully on septic. There is no public sewer system. So every single piece of property that has to recover has to deal with recovering their septic system as well. But one of the things that they actually had an advantage over us, and which we struggle with day to day, and we're continuing to see spikes in it, is how to deal with living in a COVID affected community. They were able to almost immediately gather together in person, not only to think about ideas and figure out who's going to do what, but also really to give witness to what was being suffered and the trauma that was happening. We as a community have not really been able to have a lot of opportunities to do that. And I think that's one reason why our recovery has a little bit of a jilted start to it. And there's a little sort of progress forward and a few steps back. So whenever possible, I think that those are issues that we kind of need to address. After our visit, the group of us, 6 of us, kind of put together what we would refer to as sort of our highest level learnings. And these are not specific projects always, but really just our overall sense of what we came away from. The biggest one really being that there was a broad and deep community engagement that was critical for their recovery, but also critical for them being prepared to move forward. As many of you know, the Dixie Fire is affecting that community as we speak. And so for them to be able to have had those strong connections already in place, it gets them more prepared for ongoing disasters. Their recovery also had an amazing multi-jurisdictional complexity, which they really overcame. They really gathered together both from the cities, the counties, as well as the towns that were around them, really to address this as a collective recovery. The other big learning that we had, and it was very obvious when we were there because the Dixie Fire was kind of blowing up as we were visiting Paradise, was that catastrophic wildfires are the new reality here in the West. This is not something that is a one and done kind of event. We are constantly going to be having to be affected by this. As many of you know, right now we're dealing with the smoke from other fires in the area. But again and again, wildfires are going to be at the top of the list of how do we prepare for moving forward as a community. One of the sort of concrete learnings that we had that was at the highest level is we need what they refer to as a BRIC, which is a Building Resiliency Center. And this was a centralized community space where permitting, recovery, rebuilding, community support services, community organizations, all of the agencies were in one single spot for people to come to and really start to figure out how they were moving forward in their trauma. It was essential not only for their fast initial recovery, but for their ongoing rebuilding. And the disaster recovery actually really does need to address a lot of short-term needs rather quickly, but always with an intention for how it needs to correct systematic long-term issues. One of the unique things about what we've witnessed in Paradise is how their long-term recovery transformed at about 18 months to 2 years after their disaster into what they refer to as the Campfire Collaborative or Collective. And this is really, it was a similar structure to our LTRG, but really moving on to much more long-term systematic issues within the community. And I think it's something that as we develop the R3V, we need to think about how do we start to make that transition so that it's supportive for not only individual assistance, but also public assistance. This is the group that went down there. This is what some of our FEMA hosts, which we have to say were just absolutely amazing. One of the things that they did was they gave us a binder that was sort of a summary of all the things that they had learned, resources they had developed, or that the community had developed in their recovery. And it's really a great book to kind of take a look at how can we take some of those things and put them into our recovery. To kind of narrow down what some of the key learnings are, and I'm going to go through these key learnings and then also what I would refer to as just some interesting, unique projects that we learned down there. And these are in a lot of ways sort of what we see as sort of in the highest level and the highest importance. So 211 was a service that they utilized almost from day one. And with this service, they were able for 211 to connect people directly into what was going to become their long-term recovery group. They were able to do needs assessment and actually get data on those people from day one. And then as they've moved through their recovery, continuing to have a single source of information for the entire community, as well as for people who were moving back into the community who hadn't been there before. And also, like I said, for the preparedness when they've had additional wildfire issues moving through that community. Their Building Resiliency Center, I can't stress enough how much we were just amazingly overwhelmed by this facility and the folks that are there. It truly was a coming together of all the different jurisdictions and organizations in a way where they really collectively tried to support each other's missions and goals, but also to make sure that there was not a whole lot of duplication of effort so that people didn't feel overwhelmed in how they had to go through their recovery process. Philanthropy was at their table and at all of their tables in their long-term recovery group. So not just in donations and giving, but also in their building and construction, in their economic recovery, in their needs assessment, in their disaster case management, so that really those donors, and both private and public donors, really understood the complexity of those recovery issues and were able to actually meet those needs in kind of unique ways, not necessarily always with money, but sometimes with shared services, shared support, or just information on how to connect people. This was their Building Recovery Center. It was a former bank that had been closed down prior to the fire. And so after the fire, Bank of America said, just take it, have it, use it as you wish, which is a wonderful gesture, but it really gave a space for people to gather. The other thing we wanted to note was the woman who was at the front desk, I believe her name was Kelly, I can't remember, I apologize, having a cheery, wonderful, welcoming face when you first walk in. It shifted everyone's perspective. It also allowed people to really have someone to just check in with about sort of this simple question so that it didn't bog down a lot of the people who were there from different agencies, but just someone who could answer some simple questions and keep the process moving forward. Crisis counselors were provided through FEMA for the disaster. And this was really important for their community, not only to address the trauma of the fire victims, but also really the mental health issues that were coming from the caregivers and the responders. With such a long-term recovery, those sort of mental health issues don't always show up right away. And so often people who are sort of the caregivers don't take the time to take care of themselves. And so having that kind of crisis counseling in place for the community really allowed those caregivers to continue to come back over and over and over again and stay involved in the recovery. Public gathering was something that they embraced before COVID, during COVID, and even when we were down there, we were lucky enough to actually be part of a public gathering called Paradise Party in the Park. So important that people actually got to see their neighbors, to make sort of that face-to-face contact with each other and understand and share the trauma and the struggles that they were going through, but also to really celebrate the things that were going really right. They were mentioning that their Paradise Party in the park before the fire, the amount of people that showed up was not even half as many. And just the fact that they have a shared experience makes people want to gather together and find something to celebrate. The other really interesting thing is the idea of doing an after action report that really engages the community-based organizations. So the people that were on the ground, a lot of those organizations which came up out of nowhere, were grassroots, didn't have an established organization prior to the fire, but really were there just to address the immediate needs. They have so much information for us to learn from. About really what are those initial things that need to be dealt with, but also what are some of the systematic issues that they were trying to address from day one. This was the beautiful Paradise Party in the park. It was so exciting to be able to see people out eating, having a nice glass of wine, dancing, and just enjoying each other. We were so happy that we could coincide our visit with this party. Crossing jurisdictions, that was really key to their recovery. They had a very separate city organization compared to their county organization, but after the fire, those jurisdictions really blended together to support each other, to make sure that there wasn't too much crossover, but also they were able to support each other with services and information. Construction skills are something that as a community, we need now, and we're going to need for a long time. So how do we start to integrate those kind of workforce skills into our community to provide jobs, to provide additional building support, to raise those folks who are already in the construction industry, potentially up to a higher level through additional certification or additional knowledge, but just making sure that we look at that as an entire ecosystem, because this rebuild will take years and we need labor to do that. Missing middle grants were something that I had not heard of before knowing about Paradise. And it was really about trying to find those small areas within the recovery process that if just giving just a little bit of money, just a little bit of effort to some individual family could get them to recover a little bit faster. So that could be grants for the cost of permitting, that could be special services to provide additional zoning issues. It could be for taking care of your septic because they had so many septic issues, but just what are those critical things that sometimes get lost in the costing of rebuilding? How can a community support those through granting? And that is either through public or private funding, but really making sure that you're doing whatever you can to just move the people further down the line to rebuilding. Supporting small businesses is going to be very important, not only for Paradise, but also in our community. We did have a lot of small businesses who lost their property, their buildings, and also now with the loss of population, a lot of their business. And so in as many ways as possible, how we can support them to recover, to revitalize, to bring the workforce back, and to make the communities a place that people want to be. And one of the ways that this became a focus for them was one of the committees that they added to their long-term recovery group was an economic and workforce committee. We've had a unique additional committee by adding an equity committee to our long-term recovery group, but the idea of the long-term recovery group focused on workforce and economic issues from day one, I think is really kind of interesting, and has allowed them to have those always as part of their long-term goals. This was a photo from the Campfire Collaborative. We were lucky to be there during their monthly meeting. They had not had an in-person monthly meeting for almost a year. In the room were probably 40 individuals from a variety of different community-based organizations, jurisdictions, interested parties, and then probably another 40 that were online on a Zoom call. This shows the depth of community engagement that has continued to happen for them 3 years out. Not necessarily always the same faces, but definitely the same organizations just keep showing up at the table, keep trying to move things forward, and keep trying to work on the recovery. The Campfire Collaborative is organized slightly different than a long-term recovery group, where each committee has a chair, and then the entire organization is really managed through a council of chairs. So those chairs really kind of keep the projects or the mission or the ideas moving forward, and then the actual committees are the ones who are doing that work. Important in the support that we address everyone. And we've got a lot of people who've been affected by the fire by losing their homes. We've got a lot of people who've been affected by the fire because they've lost their business. They're having to drive through the area on a daily basis. But also the idea of how do we support new people coming in, I think was really unique. The idea that we need to move beyond just those that were specifically affected by the fire, but trying to rebuild that community as a whole. Again, like I mentioned, the structure of a council of chairs was really interesting. It really centered the work on some very specific ideas and around some really specific focuses. Open sourcing as many resources as possible, and that can be anything from building libraries to public permitting to forms, but as much as possible, making it easy for people to share that information, share surveying information, share information about how things are done for insurance, whatever that might be. Opening it up as much as possible really allowed the recovery to happen. And then really looking at the regional planning overall, and that's not just from the perspective of zoning, but also really how is the community going to recover and continue to be resilient. And so one of the ways that Paradise really addressed this is in their recovery planning, looking at areas for evacuation zones, for providing additional defensible space. And this could be things like parks, but they also have opportunities where they have private easements across private land to allow for those defensible spaces to stay open to the public in the case of an additional wildfire. When we talk about the Resiliency Center, one of the unique things that they have is what was called a Rebuild Advocate. And this Rebuild Advocate was really a layperson's guide. Those of us in the construction industry have our own lingo and our own jargon, and then there's all of the jurisdictions and all of the acronyms that they have. And it can be amazingly overwhelming for someone this is the first time that they've had to go down this path, or even if they've done it several times. And so being able to step back and look at the build process from a layperson's perspective and really start to narrow things down into sort of manageable, smaller steps, manageable, smaller bits of information, and get people to continue to move that forward versus dumping all of that information at one time, and having someone that they can personally check back in with as they're having to move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction or department to department, or from the architect to the engineer to the civil to whomever, but just having one person that they can really ask, like, what is that thing that they're talking about? Developing a community recovery plan was very important, especially with regard to how we're going to develop future funding resources. So really the entire community as a whole, how we want to recover. And one of the biggest things is just a clear acknowledgement that the relationship of the community was redefined overnight. As Stephen pointed out in his opening verbiage, it changes everything, and we can make it change something for the better, which I think is very important. Some of the unique ideas, and I'm just going to go through these real quickly. We'd love to, if there's any of them here that you're interested in, we can definitely connect you in with folks down in Paradise who are actually kind of spearheading this. So public alert systems that are widespread and normalized, and that includes things like sirens as well as social media notifications. Trying to pull in AmeriCorps volunteers. For them, it was not only with their DCMs, but also with some rebuild efforts. FEMA actually was asked to forward audit requests to their long-term recovery group, which allowed that long-term recovery group to really be able to follow up with that person and make sure that if there was additional needs that they have because of the audit or clarification, they were right on them and didn't have to wait for the people to come to the long-term recovery group. Expanding the rebuild effort beyond the burn scar. Not just the burned area has been affected by the disaster. And so how do we actually take a look at the community as a whole? Business support using the collective impact model that really supports the workforce. Creating a centralized bulletin board. We, in the age of COVID, have made a lot of things online, which is wonderful, but there's a lot of people where that just doesn't work for them. And so not only having multiple ways to get information to people, but having that physical place to go to. So many people down in Paradise acknowledge the fact that it created a sense of community, that there was an actual physical place they could go to check in for information. They created a rebuilding loan program with private funding to help people rebuild both from a commercial as well as residential rebuilding. An emergency housing database, and this was developed so that in future fires or future disasters, immediate housing could be found for people so that people didn't feel like they were just kind of lost amongst the trauma. They created a property swap program so that folks from one community to another could swap pieces of land in a little bit more of a clear pathway. So that, again, if there were folks who wanted to come back to the burn scar area, they were really supported to do that. Providing home hardening grants. This sort of is, again, another one of those sort of missing middle grants, is how do you build back in a way that's going to be more resilient, knowing that catastrophic wildfires are in our future. As much and as quickly as possible, engaging with the GSA sales for both RVs, trailers, and mobile modular homes. I'm really glad to hear Alex Campbell announce that that is actually moving forward rather quickly. So it's a great opportunity to provide really quick housing for a significant amount of people. And as quickly as possible, we need to engage in that. And then also support those people, because those housing sources are not necessarily meant to be permanent. So how can we strengthen them, harden them, and improve them so that they can be permanent housing that enriches the community? Again, a building advocate as a layman's partner in this whole thing was super important. Developing a housing plan library. This is actually something that we're going to be engaged in, our housing and construction subcommittee, starting September 2nd. We're going to be having a presentation from Charles Brooks, who's going to talk about how they've set up a housing plan library, and the Southern Oregon American Institute of Architects chapter is interested in engaging in that process as well, to develop a set of sort of standardized plans that are pre-approved, pre-engineered, and really allow people to get building as quickly as possible for as little money as possible. Engaging volunteer build organizations. We haven't done a whole lot of that. Habitat for Humanity is obviously one that's here, but there are lots of other ones that travel around the country to help people rebuild their homes. A chief storyteller is an idea that I know that this group has talked about, but what was really unique in Paradise is not only did Rebuild Paradise have a chief storyteller who told their story, but they actually lent that storyteller out to other community-based organizations so that those community-based organizations could expand their capacity of how they could explain the story of how they're doing and how they're recovering. The quote that nothing about us without us was super important, and we heard over and over and over again. It's so important that those people that are affected by the fire are part of this recovery. They celebrate every rebuild, every accomplishment, every permit, every new business, and they do it vocally, they do it visually, they make a huge celebration out of it. It's important that we start to move towards the positive. Looking at mobile housing to address reoccurring fires. How can we live in this kind of an environment on an ongoing way and allow people to recover and not constantly be burned down? They also separated their unmet needs into a simple unmet needs committee and a complex unmet needs committee. And that was divided based on the value of the unmet need. And it allowed those simple unmet needs to be answered really quickly and really efficiently. And the more complex one was really where they had to dig into the information and create a sort of whole package on how to handle those. And last but not least, this is our group at this amazing cave that one of our Paradise residents let us come and hang out with. It would actually survive the fire and has now been turned into quite an entertaining space. And we were lucky enough to hang out, have pizza and drink wine and get to know each other even more. So I'd like to end it with just saying this was organized for us to introduce and share face-to-face with communities affected by wildfire. I want to thank the entire community of Paradise for their warm welcome that we received, the information that they shared, and the open hearts that they presented. The learnings that we gathered were both important for the further development of the Jackson County Long-Term Recovery Group and the recovery for a better and more resilient community. I'd like to close it with a beautiful haiku that Marta created on our trip. Some new acronyms, new faces, new stories inspire. Char didn't prevail here. Thank you all so much, and I hope this leads to some new interesting ideas.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you very much. I want to open the floor to questions. Anybody have any questions?
I do. Can you go a little bit further into, what was it, the Council of Chairs? I found that to be really fascinating. And do you have any insight on how that was developed? Who sits there and how long has that been formed?
So the Council of Chairs was how they transferred from an LTRG structure into the Campfire Collaborative. And it happened right around 18 months after their fire. So their LTRG was really, it was facilitated by FEMA, and it was focused primarily initially on individual assistance and immediate assistance. But very quickly they realized that they needed to programmatically take a look at larger issues beyond just the immediate. And what they recognized is it was really in the working of those committees where real progress was happening. And so instead of having a board that oversaw sort of all of the work of that group, they decided, let's get the right people as a chair of each one of these committees. And then that person created the committee that was going to get that work done. And that's changed over time. So how they dealt with housing in the beginning was one thing, and how it's moved on now is kind of different. But they've always sort of kept somebody as a key person who's chairing that committee. And then that person is responsible for creating the group that's going to get the work done. And then the Council of Chairs is really where sort of the integration between the different committees happens. And so when there's an issue around unmet needs and disaster case managers, that kind of comes up to that Council of Chairs. When there's an economic and workforce issues that correspond or overlap with housing, that's where those issues kind of connect. So it was a really interesting way, but it also allowed, what I thought was really important, it allowed really the skill set to be paired with the skill set and knowledge to be paired with the actual work that was happening, not just with somebody who was available. And that takes a certain level of sort of like finding the right people to get that work done. And they said, they stumbled at times where the right person wasn't there, and then they just had to work at trying to get the right person. So I think to me, it was a really interesting way to broaden out the understanding of what needed to happen and to really focus on getting the right people to do the right kind of work.
Thank you.
I want to keep the floor open to questions, but I also want to open the floor to others who were on the trip and to share their personal experiences as well.
I'll jump in. I think Julie captured it really well. That document was a great collaboration amongst everybody that went. I think that there was part of an unmentioned value, and we've all been sitting here in Zoom meetings for a year and with very little in person. And that trip was really an opportunity for us to just tighten those bonds between the various organizations and folks working in this sphere. And once we can travel a little bit more, I think it's almost a homework assignment that people should be able to go down there together in community and as representing this area and do some learnings together, and whether it's there or other places. And the only other thing I just love to highlight the BRIC, the Building Resilience Center, was very inspiring to visit. One thing Julie, I don't think she quite put a pin in it, but I always find it really poignant, is that when a person goes through their process, they walk in as a dazed sort of survivor that are now being expected to become a home builder. And that's a really daunting process for anyone. And they've gotten it down to about 4 months from walking in the door and walking out with your building permits, which is pretty awesome. And at the end of those 4 months, when that person gets their permit, there's a bell they ring together, and they celebrate that as a community. And I think that's really a thing we need to start doing. And then the Rebuild Advocate is just a crucial piece of the puzzle. I think of him as a building doula in a lot of ways, in that you're asking people who aren't skilled in that way to go through the home building process, but if they have someone else, a peer or a professional or an advocate that can help them navigate that process, it'll make it easier for everyone, or for that individual home builder. I think that was it.
Thanks, Tucker. Pam, you have your hand up. What would you like to ask?
Thank you, Stephen. That was a great presentation. Thank you. As I look around our community, you know, many single family home owners have moved forward. I don't know proportionately what percentage of the population that is, but I think we would probably agree that as hard as it is for many of them, they are in a better place than people who were in manufactured home parks, who lost everything, including their footprint in those communities. And that's the population that really hasn't returned at all yet. Maybe you can find two people in the community who have landed new manufactured homes in existing parks. And I'm just wondering if there were manufactured, was that sector hit in Paradise? I would assume that they had some loss from manufactured home parks because we all have them. And did you see anything that was particular to that population?
So there were a significant number of manufactured home parks. I would say that the percentage of homes that were destroyed were not equal to ours. They actually had more manufactured homes destroyed than we did, but because they had so many homes that were destroyed, it just wasn't the same proportion. Those manufactured home parks are just now starting to come back up online. And a big reason is their infrastructure issues. Like I said, they're all on septic. And so that was a huge amount of money that had to lay at the feet of those manufactured home park owners. Many of those manufactured home parks were not nearly as large as some of the ones that we have. And so being able to do that kind of work has been really difficult. I would say the other thing that they've really struggled with is they didn't have a whole lot of affordable housing, multifamily housing in Paradise. And the one project that they did have that they had completed, I think, and Marta, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was maybe 8 months before the fire. It was not very long, burned to the ground. And they were actually lucky enough to, partly through COVID and PPP, able to find the funds to rebuild it. And they're actually moving people in, I think, as we're speaking right now, which has been really great. But they haven't been able to figure out how to do the funding for that moving forward, because they see that as a way to bring some of that affordable housing back to the community, because the manufactured home parks just aren't going to come online quite as fast. So I hope that answers some of your questions.
I think what it does is sort of validate the challenges of
Yeah.
manufactured home parks and recreating anything that was close to what existed before. Thank you.
Marta wanted to add something, I think.
Yes, I'd like to respond to that question about mobile home parks and then share some of my own insights and reflections if possible. Some of the barriers cited to the rebuild or replacement of the 1,600 mobile home units that all of the parks lost in the Camp Fire. One of the stark differences between our disaster and their disaster is because of the large footprint, a lot of access and delivery of utility services to those parks was damaged, far more than it was on the Almeda Fire footprint. So there the utility was PG&E. So some parks were, on a wait list to continue getting services or to have it repaired, to have service brought to the site. So that was a big difference for me. At the event, I'm going to now go into the trip. Something that stood out to me were signs and billboards. There was a mobile home manufacturing company saying, we'll get a home to you in 6 months, right? The value add or the value proposition was in that timeline, we will deliver, because 3 months in, they know what the lead times for manufacturing look like. And there was a billboard for a real estate professional saying relocation specialist too. So it's a balance of welcoming those who are seeing the opportunity and wish to be a part of a community that's rebuilding, and those who are survivors. As part of the tour, I was invited at the very last minute, right before we left, to a dedication of a brand new home built by volunteers to a survivor. So to me, that was a positive and rebuild focused recap to the entire trip. And I was very fortunate to be there. Because of air quality, everybody was kind of shuffled inside, right? So I left very early not to be a part of that crowd. But it was humbling. The volunteers were there. The female volunteer agency liaison was invited and was there. The person who is the who's with the developer behind that 36 unit affordable housing that we toured, that we built, they were there. Multi-agency representation, even at, you know, kind of a rite of passage for the community.
Towards getting there, when you are without these rules, sometimes you.
Thank you. So yeah, as far as the business and economic development goes, I really appreciated the opportunity to go. This was a once in a lifetime trip for me, even though I know I will be back. To be a part of this cohort was humbling. And I think others will agree with me because of our different backgrounds, and we touch very different parts of recovery. We were able to challenge each other's assumptions. I think at some point somebody asked me, hey, what is resilience to you? And somebody said, what is acceptance to you? You know, even in the debriefs. So I appreciate Julie putting together the key learnings as well as the higher learnings. And I'm working on my own like business recovery focus memo that I will be sharing with a group that convenes as the State Recovery Function 2. That includes a little bit of FEMA, Office of Emergency Management, my agency leadership, and other regional development officers statewide. So it was great for me to build a shared understanding of what recovery looks like over there before I dive in deeper into the economic recovery aspects of what's happening in Paradise and what we can learn. So thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you for being here. Ellie, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll share a bit. It's still, thank you, Julie. That was awesome. And thank you for hosting us. I'm still recovering from our trip to Paradise. A little bit of context. So in slide 8, you may recall the Paradise Party in the Park slide. On the horizon, you can see some clouds, and those aren't clouds. Well, they are clouds. They're mainly smoke from the Dixie Fire and the clouds of its own weather system that it was creating. That was on the horizon the entire time that we were there. It was a very, very present, and for me, like pretty traumatizing, triggering thing to witness. It swallowed the town of Greenville that day and 100,000 acres while we were there watching, essentially. So it put the whole subject of recovery in a whole different light. Like how do we do this? How do we rebuild houses at $280 per square foot without metal roofs, surrounded by tree trunks and no neighbors, right? And then commit ourselves to living under smoke and in air conditioning for months and months of our lives. And in our situation here in the Valley, it's like we are going to continue living in fire and under smoke. And we don't have the mental health resources to address the trauma that brings up. Is for those of us who didn't lose our homes, like the people who did lose their homes. I can't imagine how triggering this is. So just threw into perspective the whole question of recovery, and what came up in our the long-term recovery group's strategic planning meeting months ago was, creating our mission statement of bringing people home. And that was kind of intentionally loosely defined as whatever home means to someone. And how can we encourage people, or at least let them know that it's fine for them to find home somewhere else as well. But we can't, I just want to throw out kind of the bigger picture and a bigger consideration of making it okay and enabling people to relocate if we have all these funds coming in. And is that a humane way to focus on recovery as well, as to make that clear that that's okay too, and we can help you find a place that is safe for you as well. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
I think that's an excellent point, Ellie. I know that I've had conversations with some of the FEMA folks on the call about, with floods, it's pretty easy for us to look at the Mississippi, river bottom and say, oh, you shouldn't build there, right? But then you can also look at areas that are built right in the middle of a forest and say, wow, should we be rebuilding here? It's a very interesting question. It's not an easy one to ask but I think it's important for us as community leaders to hold that context, that larger context, and to be open to, as Marta said, home is where whatever zip code you choose, and how do we help people make those hard decisions and really think clearly about that. Are there any other questions or or comments? Okay, so what we have on the agenda is to go into some breakout rooms and talk about reflect upon what struck you as things from these ideas that you would think would be useful, maybe useful here in the Rogue Valley context. What should we think about from these learnings that how could we come up with a prioritized list, maybe based on what landed with you and a few of the other folks in the call? So if that's okay, I will kind of break us into, I'll just let the system break us into some breakout rooms. And I think we had, we set aside, yeah, wow. That's kind of amazing, isn't it? We're exactly on our schedule. Good work, everybody. So we'll have 15 minutes to have a conversation, and you can come back into the room at any time if you'd like. But I'll open up some breakout rooms and just let everybody reflect a little bit on what they've learned. Jim, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I was kind of late on hitting the button there, but once I want to say, Julie, great presentation. And I spent time there at the beginning of Paradise, and you captured it. One of the things I thought was really interesting, or a takeaway, I think, from everyone here, is the evolution of a multi-jurisdictional recovery and where it started and where they are a year and a half afterwards. And how did they get together to work on a collective and a collaborative recovery approach? Because those communities were very diverse. They're very diverse when this thing happened. And the other thing that I thought would be kind of interesting, the new world order that you can really think about, I have, and I was looking for it. This is an addendum to the interlocal agreement for the management of the Bear Creek Greenway corridor dated February 14, 2008. And it was running through 2021. This is signed by the 6 signatories of this agreement, the 5 cities and the county. And in this, which is really interesting, is they mention disaster preparedness. They mention earthquakes and flooding. There's no mention of fire. And I just think that's, really, a sign of the times that what you're saying, Stephen, about preparing for disasters, clearly this is a well-written document. I've read it. It was future focused. Who in the world predicted we are where we are now? So I just want to add that to it. And again, Julie, my congratulations. Nice report. Really enjoyed listening to it.
Great. Thank you, Jim, for offering that. And I think that Greenway plan, as we've discussed, offers some really interesting opportunities, because it's like the backbone is running through all of this, and could really be an interesting place to collaborate as well as part of our recovery. The other piece that I thought was very interesting, I just want to drop in here and ask Julie, who sponsored that after action report that included the CBOs? Because I know the county did a really good after action report around what happened with the county, but do we have, who sponsored this larger kind of cross-jurisdictional one?
I'm not sure who funded it, but I know that the Campfire Collaborative was the point at which they gathered the information, but I'm not actually sure who funded it or called for it. I can find that out, but I don't know the exact answer. I'm not sure if anyone else who was there had an answer to that. Okay, I will dig into that and let you know.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so I will now break us into our breakout rooms. And again, the idea is to discuss whatever struck you from the presentation and how we might use that here, how we might put that learning into action here. in the Rogue Valley. So I'll break us into rooms now. Let's see, 4 rooms. Okay, we'll see you in about 15 minutes.
Hello, hello. Familiar people.
Yeah.
Oh.
Having substantive conversations.
Oh, good. Yes.
I'm not in any rush to get back.
Do they get like kicked back into this meeting, or do they have to choose to come back?
Well, they have a minute to choose and then they get kicked back in.
Okay.
And yeah, the idea is maybe you guys can think about this to come back with maybe 3 ideas of things that we might consider doing out of what you learned out of your conversation. Hello, welcome back. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So now I think what we'd like to do is just have a few minutes of conversation around what your conversation in your breakout room was about. And if you can, if you were able to kind of identify 1, 2, or 3 kind of projects that you think that we as a group should consider engaging with in the months to come, based on these lessons that Julie and team presented. So why don't we go to a room, the room that had Marta and Ellie in it. Let's hear from you first.
Marta, how about you report for us?
I can share one of my 3 points. It stuck out to me on the trip, and then with the mentions of zone captains in Julie's notes, how crucial that community level organization is. In Paradise, one of our tour guides, Holly, she is a zone captain in her respective zone. And we've observed in several parts of the town that recovery starts with one, right? There's like an anchor tenant in a mall. There is a crucial property that gets redeveloped or rebuilt or built, whether it's commercial and business or residential. So this just to me reinforced the importance of zone captains at a residential neighborhood rebuild level, as well as business recovery level. Bill raised a really great point about quality of life in FEMA housing, right? What amenities can truly make people feel more at home. And Ellie provided context that there is a group, I believe, one of Julie's groups that's working on amenities that could make a difference for survivors living in those spaces. And Ellie, I'll leave the 3rd one up to you. Or Katie, can somebody please chime in?
We're big fans of the brick, so that's our number 3. We'll pass the mic with that.
Great. And I think Julie and Tucker, you were in a group together, isn't that right? Does somebody from that group want to present just a couple of ideas that came up, or anybody in the group can chime in?
We talked a lot about, we actually kind of diverged a little bit and said, okay, no, just listening to the last discussion, what of the kind of R3V committee groups, working groups, or, extra lanes at the LTRG and just sort of our passion projects, where does that lead us to work in finding our sort of lanes and what we're interested in taking up the mantle of moving forward? That's kind of where we concentrated our discussions. And obviously it was as diverse as the people in the room. So not much to report specifically there, but I think it just helps clarify the conversation when you put it in perspective of a sort of a 3-dimensional, where the other fire affected community, or 4-dimensional, context, I think you're able to see things a bit more clearly. And I think that's a lesson that we certainly learned down there. But anyone else can jump into and say what they personally thought. But I think that was kind of my summary.
I think one of the things that, Pam brought up then, and I so appreciated being part of her focus, but also so many other people in community-based organizations, is one of the things that's different for us is that there is a lost community that is just not being served because they're not eligible for FEMA. And that makes it uniquely different than what we saw in Paradise. And it creates a certain struggle that we haven't quite figured out how to address. But I also feel really optimistic that if there's any community that's going to do it, we're going to do it. And then how do we share that for other communities moving forward? But the Latinx community is not being served in the way that the rest of the community is. And so how can we do that in a way that builds a stronger community back and makes it a place that people want to move to and bring their families to and start businesses. So I think that's a unique thing that we have to figure out as a community.
Right, and thanks, Julie. That links to the other kind of question that comes out of this, which is not only what project, but who else needs to be in this conversation. And that's a ongoing challenge and work of ours, is to bring the Latinx community into this conversation. Anybody else from one of the other groups? I don't remember how everybody broke out. Anybody have any other thoughts of things that they thought that R3V should consider adding to their kind of the working group structure and the list of projects that we might engage with?
I'm hoping Jim will share what he talked about in terms of grief and recovery.
I
guess that was a setup, huh? Well, what we talked with really quickly is, and this is kind of something I've noticed through the disasters and Paradise and all of them, is the idea that as we as individuals, you might hear the 5 stages of grief. And Donald, you're an expert in this, right? And you might want to talk about the 5 stages and what have you that we go through, say if we lose a loved one or divorce or something traumatic. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is your community is actually going through a grief process as in aggregate. And a lot of times it manifests itself on the first anniversary for some reason. That date's a big thing. And as I was asking Julie about the interlocals and working with the communities and how different it looks now from when it started, it was because I think it's hard to focus during that grief thing, that you've got to get through your endings before you get to beginnings and see, the future. And I think it's really useful to kind of do an assessment. Where are you? Where are you? And we're talking a little bit about the smoke. And our group, I think, and someone else, please jump in. I said, I've been down here, 3 weeks, and it's hovering around 154 to 350. And I'm going, that's kind of traumatizing, right? And what does that mean? And how does one go forward? So anyway, those are just some basic thoughts we talk about. And I think Donald's got more and the rest of the group could talk about, but I think in this evolution of how you discuss recovery, be very mindful of this within your communities and how they are. And I always say in long-term recovery, you've got to wait for it, wait for it, wait for it, because it has to be organic. It has to be from the community up, not top down. And God forbid if the government comes in and tells you what a solution looks like, that's not a good place. And so, you're that bottom up thing. And then when are you really ready to have the discussion? When can you see the issue clearly? When can you look at different options? And then you start getting traction on what the future looks like, a bigger, better, stronger future. So those are just some thoughts, just rambling thoughts.
Great. We always appreciate your rambling, Mr. Pierman.
I think the other thing that came out of that, our group, was a discussion of the need for us to pull the local governments together to work as a team rather than in some ways competing for resources, and what might be the best group to bring that together. And what I brought up was, especially, there's of course competition between communities, but there's always a very strong competition between cities and the county governments. And that's it. It's been here, it's any place you go, you're going to find that deal and that sense of power that they have. And my suggestion that they look at some bodies such as the Council of Governments or something to be a potential convener where people can meet on an equal basis, focus what Jim talked about on their common goals and what their objectives are, rather than focusing on their differences and protecting their part of their piece of the action, so to speak. So those were the two things, but recognizing that we're going through, and then the re-traumatizing effect of the smoke, because it just is a reminder that this is the type of future we're facing, and we're going to need to learn how to deal with that and how to grow from that. So
Thank you, Don. That's great. And is there another group that I've missed? I think we've touched everybody who was in a group. Anybody else have thoughts on anything that's shared? And then I'll share what Denise and Christina Kruger and I talked about. All right, jump in if you have anything. So what we talked about was related to what Jim and Don were just saying, which is mapping. We need to remain kind of contextualize where we are in this process, and maybe make that both in terms of the recovery, kind of the nice FEMA map, but I think the FEMA map has this kind of emotional roller coaster on there as well, and think about that in terms of stages of grief, etc. And I think that may be a useful thing to take on. I think R3V definitely needs to be looking at the structure of that, the Council of Chairs. I think that's a really, really interesting structure, and so we will be looking at that. And I think that there's also, we had a really interesting conversation around some of the things that came up around, this hard truth, like we look at Paradise and the incredible tenacity and community spirit that's come together there to rebuild, and they have 20% of their population is back after 3 years. There's something structural happening there, and it could be cost of building, it could be all kinds of other things. But there needs to, there was a sense in our group that there needs to be someone who, and periodically, maybe it's once a quarter, that we bring staff and other folks together who can really talk about the structural nuts and bolts of where are we in this recovery and what are the obstacles that we're seeing, and just have and like have a disclaimer, like a trigger warning, and say, if you're looking for happy talk, this is not the meeting, this is the one that's going to be really rough, but it's going to be really searching for the truth. And maybe that's a place for R3V to do a little bit of convening around that and holding that. And because I think that, we're Americans, and we can kind of get into almost toxic positivity and action orientation rather than dealing with some of the really hard truths, the structural barriers that we have to getting what we back to normal, right? So that's what came out of our space. So I've made notes of everything that we've said here. We'll work this into our working group structure, and I just want to open the floor for any other thoughts on this. And also I want to open up the floor to the question of, a month from now, what do you think might be an interesting topic to discuss? What's going to be alive in September, in the third week of September, that we should step into.
Stephen, I just wanted to parlay onto what you talked about the hard truth of recovery. And I do think that Paradise has had some real issues that they've had to deal with. And I think we actually as a community need to recognize that we're actually doing well compared. We have about 18% of the homes that were lost have been permitted to be rebuilt. That's in less than a year. That's amazing. Now, it doesn't mean that it's across the board equal across the population by any stretch of the imagination. But I think what we do need to take a look at is, where is the recovery not happening? Not if it's not happening, but where is it not happening? And how do we put the resources there compared to what's already naturally occurring because the processes have been developed? But I think it's important not to paint too much of a doomsday picture, because we need to encourage people to move back to the area, even if they weren't residents before, but that they want to come here and be part of the growth, you know? So it's important to balance both of those.
Agreed. Go ahead, Mr. Pearman.
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to hitchhike on what Julie said. Absolutely. You guys are light years ahead of Paradise for so many reasons, and you should feel really good about what you're doing. I have to tell you, dealing with the city managers and the Greenway and the whole idea of collective working and working towards this, it has been a pleasure. I mean, these people are committed. I think the future is really, really bright. And I think that there's some really great community leaders here that are going to be putting in a lot of dog in this fight to make it happen. So I think you're really quite blessed with this community and the way that people feel about it. So hopefully I wasn't doom and gloom, Julie. I just want to say that because I think that this is really good stuff, but there also should be a recognition. This isn't easy either, right? And you just got to stay with it. Just got to stay with it.
Yeah, I really like that, Julie, that talking about where recovery is happening, celebrating every ounce of that, and still talking about where it's not yet and what we want to do about that. I think that could be a really useful lens through which to look at this. Pam, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to share along those lines. On September 14th, I'm going to be hosting a webinar, hour and a half, where we'll have representatives from the cities, from the long-term recovery group, from the school district, from the Latino Latinx community, with the idea of a report to the community 1 year later. Where are we on recovery? What have we done? And what is the work that's still to come? Trying to give people, I think, a global view of what's taken place here, because I think we have very fragmented ideas of that individually. If we have any notion that we're recovering at all, it's probably based on our own personal experience. So the intention of the 1 year report to the community is to try to compile. We won't be able to address the wealth of issues that are out there, but try to compile some of the key sectors to really speak to what's happened over the past year and what's still to come. So September 14th, 6:30 in the evening, we'll record it. If anyone is interested, please jump in. But I mention it because it's really aligned with where you're suggesting that we might go with this group.
That's great. That's great. And our group is not interested at all in duplication of effort. So I'm really glad that that's happening. And if we can help you publicize it, we would love to do that. So we're a little bit over. This has been, to me, a very fruitful meeting and great to be with all of you. And if anyone has thoughts about what we might think about for next month, would love to hear those. So blessings. Thank you, Tucker. You have something?
Just real quick, Pam, it'd be great to get some info. We're just finishing putting the final touches on the newsletter right now for the LTRG, and trying to find anything now that the anniversary events have been canceled. If anyone has any other thing, like I know that the First Presbyterian in Phoenix is going to start ringing their bell at 11:07 a.m. on September 8th to mark the anniversary. I know there's a to-go ice cream social. I know there's a JPR kind of broadcast, but anything we can give people that's COVID safe, virtual, et cetera, to help mark the anniversary. I think it's a very important time. And we're trying to get that in like today or tomorrow into the newsletter. So please send them my way. I will just put my email in the chat if you've heard anything. We just want to give people options to mark that time.
Tucker, that's a really interesting idea. And Christine is not here from Winter Spring, but she may have some, or they may have some interesting ideas about how to personally commemorate and just hold a moment for everything that's unfolded from that day. So I'll connect you. I'll reach out to her myself and
That'd be
see if
great.
she has some ideas and feed it to you.
Well,
Okay.
that's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all you do. See you soon.
Thank you.